Sergio. Bonjour et re-bienvenue à cette émission. En fait, c'est une série de 12 émissions d'une heure qu'on fait sur le sujet de nos voisins. Donc, ça s'intitule les Kanien'keháka, qui sont nos hôtes sur le territoire, mais nos voisins au quotidien. Alors, cette semaine, on prend un pas de plus que la semaine dernière. La semaine dernière, on a parlé de tourisme. Cette semaine, on va aller sur le terrain. Et pour nous accompagner, on a un guide touristique de Kahnawake qui est avec nous aujourd'hui et son nom c'est Harley Delaronde. Fait qu'il est avec moi présentement. Harley, it's a great pleasure meeting you. Very happy to be here in Kahnawake and to go around town. I don't know if you can talk to us a little bit about where we are and what we'll be doing.
Yeah, we're located at the offices of the Kahnawake Welcome Center, Kahnawake Tourism offices, and which is really located in the center of the oldest part of Kahnawake, the original area where Kahnawake arrived in this spot. In 1716, so we're right in the. There's some relatively historic buildings and so on in this area, and it's that we'll see some of those, and I can talk about them. But that's where we are right now for this, and so in this office that people are usually greeted here. Yeah. And they come here and they can, plan whatever, get some information and visit the community, get some direction on some of the sites and places to go and some of the places they may be interested in. So this is where they would come, and he would be right in the heart of Kahnawake, the old part. So here, if you just look around for a second, we also have certain things that are in here. Right now they're in a bit of a transition because there's some of the elements of the office are also being moved to a brand new facility, which is basically the new Cultural Arts Center, and which is behind here. Yeah, it's right here. We'll see that a little bit later, I hope. And that this is a mock-up of it. And so that there's a whole transition. And there's a few things that before we begin, I wouldn't mind talking about some of the things that are really important to the history of Kahnawake, the history of the people of Kahnawake Ronu, which means people who are from or a person of Kahnawake. And so some of that is one of the things that you look behind here. There's some people may see that flying from time to time, a purple and white flag. Mm-hmm. And what that is, it's very important to the whole history of our people, the Kanien'keháka, as part of a confederacy of 5 and later 6 nations. In our language, we refer to it as the Haudenosaunee, or some people refer to it as the Iroquois or the 5 or 6 nations confederacy. So Kahnawake is one of the communities of the Kanien'keháka nation. And so in one of our very important stories about how this whole confederacy and how of these group of nations came together, the story basically revolves around a time when our people, the 5 nations, were in a time of struggle, conflict, a lot of fighting and a lot of negativity and just a terrible time. And the story in our tradition is that an individual came with a message of peace. Mm-hmm. And he went, and there's a long, involved, epic story about how he went about with this message of peace, and he acquires some people to help him. And one of the men was called Ayawata. He was from the Mohawks, or the Kanien'keháka. And they go about to all the nations trying to convince the other people from the villages and from the different family clans and from the different nations, all of that, to agree to live in this peace, to change this. And so there's this amazing story with so many different elements to it. And what ends up happening is he finally convince the people to come together and, as they say, bury their weapons of war that they use amongst each other. So there's a lot of symbolism. They bury the weapons of war at a certain spot. They plant a tree of peace to symbolize that we are going to all agree to this peace. And so when this happened, and they also developed not just the idea of peace, but a whole system on how to deal with disagreements that might come up or issues that might come up that might cause some conflict at times. So they said, we're all going to agree on this. And it became very formal. As a matter of fact, that system, which is still has always continued. That's always, and that is our traditional form of making decisions, our traditional government system that has never stopped. It has had challenges many times throughout history from different governments and the societies, but it has never stopped completely. It's always been in place. And so that anyhow is very important. And when they had this agreement, you would use a wampum. The wampum was very valued, made from the shells of a quahog clam. And the people would use the wampum to signify this event, this agreement, or some type of, whatever, they would usually do that. And so that's the wampum. And the wampum, it's purple and white. Most of the wampum are purple and white because that's the type of shell, the colors. Right, yeah. They made it, it's actually, the wampum normally is looked at when you turn it this way. That's right. So you're looking across, and there's 5 symbols on there. And from left to right, if you're looking at it from the top or top to bottom, it would be the Seneca, who are in Western New York. You're heading towards Buffalo, New York, and Niagara Falls in that area. The Cayuga would be next. And then there's a tree, the tree of peace that was planted that symbolized the peace. That's the territory, the land of the Onondaga, which is near Syracuse, New York. Mm-hmm. And then you go a little bit further, you go down, and that would be the Oneida. And then finally the one at the bottom or to the right, we would be the Kanien'keháka, or the Mohawks. The Eastern Door. Yeah, the Eastern Door. So that has been there. That's been in our tradition. That's the symbol of that very, very, very important element, I guess I would call it, of the culture and of our, not just the culture, but also our government, symbolizing the unity. Sorry, it's called the Hiawatha Belt. So in the last, I'm guessing about 40 years, our people didn't have flags, but various events involving came to be. One of them, for example, was the development of our international lacrosse, our national lacrosse team, which are quite competitive on the world stage, because that lacrosse, you see the one of the wooden sticks up on top there. Lacrosse being one of our sport, if you would call it. And so there's a lot of stories about that. But one of the things is they developed a team to play at world championships. They were admitted. And there's a whole story about that. And there's a lot of stories to talk about that. But essentially what that is they said, we need to fly a flag also. We're going to these events. Exactly. And that's my memory of when it first really began to come in, and then it just took off. They would wear it on the uniforms, and then now you see it everywhere. Flags, stickers, bumper stickers, whatever. It's and we might probably see a couple of cases of it in the community now. It's a symbol of pride.
I have one on my motorcycle helmet.
Yeah, you see them on the school over here. There's a school nearby and so on. So I just wanted to see different things. You see some example of a more recent, but also a traditional woman's, garment that they would wear with a lot of beadwork, which is also an aspect of that's become a more it's something which bringing in glass beads from Europe. Our women transformed years back from using different stitching of porcupine quills and different other elements of different grasses and so on and plants. And then they incorporated beadwork, and it's become something that our people in a more modern time have taken on and basically developed some amazing beadwork that is all, and some of them are here examples. And you can see some of the examples of things, and you see the design that if someone was to look over here, we got examples of it. Yeah, exactly. So I just wanted to really just talk about the site and talking about the spot. But then there's so much more about this area to talk about and talk about the history. But that whole history, we cannot talk really, with really any clarity without knowing some of the background of who we are and our territory. And our territory, as far as we have always said, it extends from Montreal all the way down to near Albany, New York, what's called the Mohawk Valley in that area, throughout the Adirondacks area. That's traditionally Kanien'keháka, or we call it in the language Kahnawake. Okay, and so that's important to know. Mm-hmm. And historically, I could talk a little bit later, but historically our people lived here, moved about, would live in a place for 20, 30 years until the wood, it's too far to go and get wood anymore. That's right. It was the fields were a little depleted because we were people who planted, gardeners. We weren't just hunters. We planted the three sisters. The corn, beans, and squash were staples. In the language, it refers to as the sustainers, Kanien'keháka. That type of thing, and it means they sustained us. So they were so important, and it really dictated the type of culture we had. And a big part of the culture is the importance of the woman. The importance of the woman being, and that even goes to our creation story and so on, and how that is important, and the elements of the woman, the sky world, the woman falling from the sky. So it's true out there. So you can't talk about the Kahnawake, the community, without knowing some aspect, or at least you don't do a good, you need to know more than you get a sense of what. But when the French arrived in this area, and when the first contact was, things didn't go well. And so the story, the way I understand it, is our people pulled back a little. When they weren't, things were well down in most of our villages were in the south. There were some here in what we consider the northern area, but to the south more. So people went there because their early contact wasn't good. They had a little bit better with the British or the English in the south, the Dutch, and then later. So they were a little bit early on better. But as time went on, there's a whole, we'll talk about, but I don't want to take my...
That's right, but
so we'll stop there.
We'll be seeing...
more about
that's
that.
right, we'll be seeing more of the movement of the community.
Yeah.
So we're going to take it outside and go check it out.
Yeah,
so
I think that'd be best then. Yeah.
We'll see you in a little bit.
Okay.
All right, so we're here behind the church, and one hell of a historical site. I think you have quite a few stories to tell us about.
There's a few stories I have to tell, because I do like to come, I like to when visitors come, and then I show them a bit, I point out a few things, important things, and I tell the odd story or two. And of course the important things, as you said, we're behind the church, but we cannot, we have to understand how important that was to the history of Kahnawake. Now, of course, the community has changed and evolved a lot, but at the time when this community was here, the majority of the people had become Catholic, Christianized, and very much so. And so it was very important, like many of the communities around us, where the church was a center of a lot of the social life and the spiritual life. So this is here, and then the church eventually started like a small, and it grew and grew. What happened was, so our people had moved there, but before we talk about that, and the church actually being here, but you got to remember that what had happened is, as I had said in an earlier, I think part of what we had said, what happened was our people became many of them, because it was a time of turmoil, especially in the southern part of the Kahnawake in the Mohawk Valley. There was a lot of diseases. Families some communities were losing 80 to 90% of the people to disease, to smallpox, for example. And many people began to decide that because it wasn't popular among the people who were in the valley, to convert. but some people moved in and became converts, and there's a lot of discussion about why and how that came to be. But for sure, some of them did. And in order at that time, with all of the things going on, many of them decided to move to the northern part, back to our territory, for different reasons. Some people say, well, it was spiritual, like because to practice the faith. Some people say it was economic, to be closer to trade, to the French, and instead of being in the south, and they would have more access to French items. And some people said that it was also an assertion of that this is our territory, that we should have a presence. So there's different ways to look at it. So essentially what happened was near La Prairie, right next to La Prairie, the old church on La Prairie in the mid 1600s, the number of people who were escaping a lot of the turmoil that was in the south, some of the wars, some of the diseases, were hoping to escape it, came to the north and resettled the territory, which we've always known as ours. Was we would have villages here, but as I had said, had moved for a period of time. We resettled first to La Prairie, and then soon after they moved to another site, which was right next to Kanien'keháka. And in our language, we called it, the first site was called Kahnawake, and the second site near Kanien'keháka was called Kahnawake, which means by the rapids. So that probably was why they called it, because right near Kanien'keháka, the rapids, Lachine Rapids are there. And there were two other moves after that, a few other moves, and one near St. Catherine, right at Côte St. Catherine or St. Catherine. And then the next one is at a site we're going to go see pretty close to in the community, but further to the east. And then finally, people moved to this spot here and eventually stayed here. Now, part of the reason our people moved was just normally that's what they did. Within 15, 20 years, as I said, I think I had said before, that what would happen was it was harder to get firewood. We didn't have the horses yet at those times, or much of the cows to haul things around. So it was a lot of work to go further and further, but also the fields, the corn, the beans. After a while, they needed to be refreshed in one way, so they would move. They would move the villages, the longhouses that our people lived in. And so in 1716, came to this spot here. Catholic, mostly practicing Catholic, but also keeping a lot of the cultural ways and trying to find ways to incorporate that. Part of the story of this community, a big part of it, was the woman, Gadari Tekakwita. Kateri was our way in our language of saying Catherine. Okay, so she ended up recently, I think about 20 years. I don't get the date exactly, I forget at this time, but she became a saint by the Catholic Church after a long period of time, and there's a whole story about that, and et cetera, and there are some. To church, there's some things that people can see about the bones and the relics and so on, in a small interpretive center. So that was here. So the community came here in about 1716, and like I said, eventually stopped. Now, too, what happened is people here, the French regime at the time decided it was a time of concern about wars and so on, and protecting. And what happened was they built a fort here, and to where I'm pointing here is one part of the fort wall, which basically surrounded the French garrison and the church. It was all tied into the church, all of the buildings that went with this area of the church, and then the garrison was housed further near where the tourism office was. So they're all in this area. So they moved here, but to the east was the village with longhouses of the people, and there were a number of rows of longhouses where people anywhere from 15 to 40 or 50 people could even live in these, in some of even more, in each of the longhouses. So the people lived in there, but they were outside the fort wall. So this is what happened. 1716, the people moved here, and they started to build a fort, and the reason being, again, like I said, protecting the area, but also an early defense and protecting Montreal and that was a big part of it. Nothing ever happened because it became a period of time of peace. One of the stories is, of course, that we talk about here is that the fort had basically only 3 walls built. The wall here that's next to the village was outside where the fort wall was to be, outside the church over here. And the story, depending upon who is telling it and what their point of view is, that number one, it was just the people did not really completely trust the French garrison to not eventually at some point turn the guns on them if there was some conflict and they were pulled in one direction or the other. The other one was that they just ran out of money. And the other one could have been the times where just that there wasn't a need to anymore because the threat from attack would lessen. So there's, depending, you could say all 3 maybe. So that's what ended up happening. And so this is an area that we have a lot of older buildings and so on. Now, so time goes on, people are living here, primary farming there were a lot of other economic things our people got involved in, the fur trade. We go right behind right on the other side is where the center, the beginning of the fur trade was in Lachine. The whole fur trade started there. And many men from these communities here, our community, this community, got work as voyageurs, and there's even stories about some of them, and we know there's none of these stories. It was actually happened where some of these men went all the way out to Alberta, and there are some of them stayed there, married, and started a new life. And there's people who have come back. A couple of the bands, if they would have, some Crees have come back and they researched it and they said some of the person who started our group, our community, was originally from here. There was one called Callihu, near Callihu, Alberta. And Callihu, Alberta, they have that story about, and they said, and they've looked at their research and said, but the name Callihu, they realized, came from the man. His name was, at the time he took on the name Michel, but his Kanien'keháka name was Garohio. Michel Garohio was his name, and Hio became Callihu at the end. Okay. And so it became him, and then that's how they got their name. It was this man who came from here, Michel Garohio, because a lot of people only used either, their Kanien'keháka name, or at those time, we're talking 250 years ago or so, they would use that their Kanien'keháka name and maybe a Christian name that they were given, not necessarily a last name. So there's so much to talk about, but one of the things to talk about here is when you look you see how the river is further behind, and right in front of us is the St. Lawrence Seaway that many people are aware of, and it's transporting the ships going into the interior of North America, and economically the benefits. It was built in the mid-50s, basically. It was completed in 1959, and the story about you got to understand that life for this community centered on the river, like many other towns and so on. But life was about the river. It was the mode of traveling, one of the main modes. It was fish, food, and also just being by the river. All of the other things, whether it be activities by. And so we have this river here, and so it became very important. The river actually went right to where this little stone wall is, and I should turn this way.
That's right, yeah.
So the river here was right here. The church went, and then the river here. People further down had their homes, and they had access to the river, and then that was it. And you can see it further on this end. And the wall you see of stone here is an artificial wall built by the Seaway when they built it. It's part of, and ships. We just saw a ship a few minutes ago pass by. The ships come by, and it just becomes part of. But life. But what it did when they built that, it had many impacts. And of course, one of the things, it just cut us off from the river. 80% of the community, maybe more, were basically cut off from their access to the river, which was very important. Now we're talking in the 1950s. And so many other things, incursions that happened, bridges being built. Before that, the Mercier Bridge, train bridge, which is behind us, other things that were brought in, other roads were beginning to get built. And so this comes on in 1950s, and the government really didn't consult. They just decided this is important to all of Canadians, and they decided that it was better to build it on this side. And so our community really was the most impacted of any, if you look at it. If you just get the visual,
people
look at it.
don't realize that the seaway, they think it's just one little part, but it's the whole community that's completely cut off from the St. Lawrence, because the seaway goes the whole way through the whole land lot of the community.
And if you want to get to the river, you have to go farther to the end. You might have to have access. You have a boat if you want to get into the river, or
cross over this artificial rock thing.
Yeah, you have to cross over that, and so that's really important and to understand. But my recollection too is that the stories that I've heard and the research that's been done was what it also did, physically cutting us off. There was a whole social part to it. The social part was that I heard stories from my mother especially and other old elders then, and I was very young when I was like 4 or 5 years old when the Seaway first opened, and my memories are there. And she remembers such wonderful times by certain areas where people would gather, and it was basically the summertime. People, like I said, would fish, they would gather, they'd bring their families, they'd make picnics, they would spend the whole day. She talked about it was wonderful growing up. And then in the 50s, they just came in and they said, we're putting it here. And here's some, they said, we're going to give you a small amount of money, and here, you better take it. Or if you don't take it,
we're going to put it in.
We're going to put it in, you're going to get less. So they put pressure. And there was immense amount of pressure put on people. People resisted, tried their best, but it wasn't a time where they felt that they were, that's something you could do. This was just big government and this big, powerful monolith, if you want to call it, overwhelmed, and they're going to put it through no matter. There's stories about people basically being taken off their area, their homes, digging around them and just leaving a little piece of area where they could go off. And just the pressure on the people.
People don't realize, they hear about stories like this, and they don't realize what impact it really has. For example, when we talk about contributions, this is an involuntary contribution of the Mohawk people to the greater society, or settler society, because the ships that go through here, they bring all kinds of stuff that's afterwards used by society, goods that are being sold, equipment that is needed for industry, and so on and so forth. So people don't realize at what point whatever goes through here is essential to our survival and our way of life. But it's not seen that way. It's like, by the way, it's just it's a give me, automatic give me.
It's not seen that. People definitely don't. And the generation now growing up, it's just a fact of life. But it's for the older people like myself and my memories, is not something that was very positive. What it did was it also drove a rift within families in the community, where some people felt others just gave in too soon, others didn't fight enough. And so that was important, that for a long time people have to get, and there's still some people that still probably struggling to get through that, the elders. And it was just the psychological and the emotional, the social impacts besides the physical. It was all of those things that, and I think what it was one of the key, me as a teacher and an amateur historian, is I always look at it and I say that was one of the key points was the Seaway going through, and that's what made the community say, not another inch anymore.
Exactly.
Not another inch. We should have stopped that, but we didn't. But now we're going to stop any other. We are going to decide what. So that's really important.
Because it's the artery, the economic artery, and there's no return or hardly anything in return.
And of course, it didn't go on the other side. There was already a small canal on the other side, Lachine Canal. It was already, they could have wide, but we're going to disturb more. people, maybe there's more money involved in it, et cetera, et cetera. So again, part of it, the way I look at it is, it was like, well, they're not quite as important. There's less money involved. They won't put up as much of a fight. Won't be as complicated. All of these reasons, but ultimately saying you aren't as. That's part of it. But it was funny. I have
you were telling me about your story when you saw it go through.
I had a story myself about the seaway coming through, and that day, I remember. Now it's funny that we were against it, but as a little kid, you were excited because we were hearing that this queen was going to come, and on TV we'd seen the queen. We wanted to see this queen because that's we heard about it, and we're going to get a chance to glimpse the queen. It was very exciting. So, even though it wasn't a great thing for the community and so on, and when they opened it and they flooded it and they opened it up now, and I remember my grandfather decides, we're going to have an event of this anyway, it's here. So we put up a frame, we put up a cover, and we made a picnic for the family, because we're going to see, there was an opening down in Montreal, and then they came through St. Lambert, through Locks, and through St. Catherine, and we had heard and so there was these ships. I'm 5 years old, and there's ships going through, and the ship's going, and there's a military ship. I've never seen that. You can imagine, 5 years old, first time seeing this, and hoping that ship might fire its cannons or something. I was excited. 2 or 3 or 4 ships went through, and so on. They were going through, and then the Royal Yacht came. We were waiting for it was called Royal Yacht Britannia, with all the flags flying, and the soldiers or whatever, the naval guys in their white uniforms. They passing right to the east of us, where our family was picnicking, and we were waiting to see the Queen. So I'm waiting, and with my couple other cousins, and the ship goes by, and no Queen. So I was really disappointed. I was like almost, I wouldn't say heartbroken, but I was really disappointed. And so it goes by, she comes in this area, and everybody was like, where's the Queen? And like I said, there were all things, they had just opened it, there were all things floating around. And then all of a sudden, floating nearby was a high heel, of a woman's high heel. And I remember looking at it, and my uncle, one of my uncles, I don't remember who, he's there, he yells, look, it's the Queen's high heel. And for about 5 seconds, as a 5-year-old, I went, I remember trying to get to it, throwing a rock so it would come in, and then I'm hearing laughter. And then they knew they tricked us, and I went, and then I realized it, and I went, oh, and I ended up writing a story about that, a humorous story and the memories of the Queen's shoe, and how, and then contrasting like what we were as young people, what we saw, we weren't quite aware of the impact, and also wondering, well, our community was against it, but we didn't make the connection of the Queen and all of this and why they built it. Some of us didn't anyway at that time, but now as time went on, we realized. And so it's had a real negative impact on the community in a lot of different ways. So and then the other thing I talk about, or I like to talk about, is briefly, and maybe we'll go to another site later, but one of the economic aspect. I mentioned the economic parts of with the river being here, and about fur trade and so on, and other things and opportunities for work and so on. So in 1876, I believe it was, the government decided to, or whoever, company decided to build that train bridge there. The Canadian Pacific Railway built a train bridge. And that was a significant part of the more like what we say modern economic life of Kahnawake. Yeah. And it's something that was really the impetus at the beginning. So earlier, the Victoria Bridge had been built, and part of the building of Victoria Bridge was there were some men who worked there as laborers, and also a lot of the stone came from this community. There's quarries throughout and there still are quarries here. Yeah. And the stone, I found out, is very, very great stone. And so that stone was used at Victoria Bridge, and also to build the base of the piers for this bridge. So that was going on, and the men from the community got work, and they ended up laborers. Yeah. But as time
getting the experience,
and then pretty soon they began to climb around, and the company, Canadian Pacific bosses and people said, hey, they're pretty good at climbing around here. They're pretty, like, they want to learn. So they began to train them. And that was the start of the iron workers that started here for sure in 1876. Wow. And so that is an important, and it's still there. And it's still a part, a memory. So when I say, sure. And then of course there's a lot of other stories about that I could talk about later. Or
yeah, well, actually, speaking about the bridge, I think maybe we can go to the site for the memorial, and then together we can talk about that. Yeah, that would be great. Yeah, for sure.
Some of the history of that. Yeah, we'll do that.
Certainly. Yeah. So let's head out there now.
All right.
So here we are at the memorial. Maybe you can talk to us a little bit about it, and then we can make our way down to the principal epitaph.
Yeah, well, this memorial that we're at was built in 2007, and the memorial is basically to commemorate the loss the community had of 33 men in the Quebec Bridge, the old Quebec Bridge, in 1907. Yeah. And so, there's a lot of story behind that, and so what I will say though is that, first of all, is that this memorial is a beautiful memorial here to commemorate it. As part of it is that there's a group of people who basically volunteers who said when that happened, the 100th anniversary was coming up, they said we need to remember of this event which happened in the community, which had a really huge impact on us in many different ways, the more modern history of Kahnawake. And so that was built, and the thing about this area, this memorial here, is it's a beautiful spot picked, but all of the research was done by these group of people about a variety of things, about who these individuals were, who their families are, et cetera, et cetera. And then when the memorial was built, you'll see later, that they placed this here, but also part of the memorial that we'll see later is the part which is supposed to look like part of a bridge, okay? And it was actually, the steel was donated by a company from the community, and the men who erected it and put this in place all did it voluntarily. They were iron workers who had skill and knowledge and volunteered their time. So it's a full circle. Yeah, exactly. And so that whole memory here is going to be here for a long time, trying with the whole idea that we don't forget that. We don't forget those men, and I'll talk if you want to begin to talk.
Sure, we can head out there.
And here, and there's, like I said, you can see all the individuals, the names. Part of the research this group of people did was they dug extensive research into who the families, the living, basically the relatives. It would be, I know myself, one of the people that died on it was my great-grandfather's brother, so things like that. And then they would find, and then they informed us that, oh, you have a relative, and sometimes we didn't know, many people did, but some people didn't, that you're related to someone who passed on in this event that happened over, now 19 years or so. Yeah.
So this is the monument itself.
This is the monument here that was the steel that was put up, and as and it's by the partially by the river, but by it's behind us is there's an island of part of the seaway that I had talked about before, and this is there were groups of islands here, but it's been a whole for a long time after the seaway too. It was not a very nice area, not a very place you want to go, but over years the community has tried to beautify it, both the island and the area, and this is a more recent. There's bike paths here. It's a really nice place to just relax and contemplate and just enjoy some of the nature and the effort the community has put in to do that, to memorialize and remember our men and the whole history behind it. So when we talk about the ironwork, I think earlier I was talking about the bridge that was built in 1876 and the men who worked and began to get hired on and get trained. And so what happened was when that was over, the men of the community said, hey, this is an area we could actually, benefit from, a field, a career, if you would, to do that. Let's do that. We know enough. And so there was actually smaller jobs. I've researched, I heard that there was one of the first was when they built the bridge at Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. Okay. So some of the men went out there and began to work. And then in early 1900s, word of Quebec Bridge was being built, this bridge across. And so many of the men went there and got work. They were fairly experienced, so they got work there. And so the story is that the company that was basically doing that, there were mistakes made, okay? And some of the mistakes were ignored too. That's the unfortunate part about it. So there's a lot of research about it. And so one day, basically there were warning and so on, but people like things cracking and so on, but it was still ignored, and many of the men still went to work. The bridge ends up, the southern part of the Quebec, because it was a cantilever. It was a new style bridge where it is coming out like this, and there wasn't a lot of like piers, I guess. So in an engineering, new engineering style. So they were coming across, and the southern part of the bridge collapsed. And there's posters on that with pictures that we have in the community at the Welcome Center. There's one that can be viewed. And so that collapsed. 76 total men died. Wow. 33 of the 76 were from Kahnawake. At the time, Kahnawake had approximately 2,000 people. So you try to put that 33 men at one time. Today we're talking about close to 9,000 people in that ballpark of Kahnawake. So you do the math, and you're talking close to, now we're getting close to 150. Yeah. If today 150 men died in one shot from this community, it would be catastrophic.
Exactly.
And it was
Every
catastrophic.
family would have been touched.
Everyone was touched. So, and the story is that the word got out, and there was one phone in the whole community, which was not far from the old part of the community, at a post office that was there. It was the only phone in 1907. So the story is everyone would gather to get word if they found their family member, their loved ones. And so there's all of that history about that. So it was a really terrible time. You can again imagine not just the economic part, the aspect, but also the whole, the human part, the social, what it did, and all of that. And so what has happened too, there were other things, like they took some of that steel and was put on where many of them were buried in the cemetery. They made steel crosses that are still be viewed in the cemetery today, of some of them. And then there's two crosses that are, one near our tunnel that comes through the main Old Malone Highway, and one further up near the other end of the community where they're there. And those were built, I'm not sure the exact year, back 60, 70 years ago at least. They were put up there to remember that event, and they're still there. But one of the important results that really, to me, the really important result was the men that were left. Some of them hadn't been there. They said, we still want to work because it's lucrative. It brings money. We need that. We also, the community, our families need something, and we can do that. We want to continue, and so my understanding was there was like, well, no, we don't want that, So, but the men said, we want to. And so the story is the woman of the community said, if you do that, we don't want you all to be on the same job. We don't want the same level of, so you need to split up, you need to scatter, and you have to go all over to find work. You can't, and there wasn't enough work going on in Montreal
So that's
area.
when they went to the States.
So where was the big building boom in the 1910, 1914, into the 1920s was New York, Boston, Philadelphia, those cities in the eastern seaboard, United States area. So that's where the bridges and it's now the time of skyscrapers was beginning, 20, 30, 50, 60. Yeah. So many of the men went there to get that, but they made sure there was a lot of work there so they could do it. And the term booming out came out, and that was like to go, the way I understand it, I could be wrong, but it's like moving different places. And that continued. There are men, the history, and building a reputation of being, maybe many people said that the best iron workers, they nicknamed the Skywalkers. They would, and there were the magazine articles written about magazine articles and even video documentaries and so on of the
famous
history.
pictures of the guys on the beam.
Yeah, exactly. On the I forget what the I still don't remember what the name of that building. It'll come to me. I keep saying, and but that wasn't the Empire State Building. Yeah. And so they went out there, and of course at that time, especially in New York, there was a lot of work going on, the different bridges in Manhattan. So many of them went to work there, but what began to happen was these men at that time would, they're building a reputation. At that time, they had to, it was a 12-hour, 14-hour trip back.
That's right.
There was no big highways in the early part, and, maybe longer, even some cases. So they would say they'd bring their families. So many people would bring their families, their children would go to school, and sometimes the woman would get jobs in the area or take care of the family, whatever, but the men would work. And one area, the area that became popular, maybe a 4x4 area, block area of Brooklyn, New York, and it got the nickname Little Kahnawake. It was an area called the Gowanus district of Brooklyn, New York. And so that whole area was rooming houses, men from the community, even people from the community would buy pieces of a piece of property and then rent it out to men from the community and so on, and the rooms. And so and then the stores nearby began to stock some of the food that are people like a certain type, like maize, it's cornmeal, for example, for cornbread, which is popular for our people to eat. Things like that. They would have restaurants or watering holes they would enjoy to go, and they became popular. So there became a whole community, and they got the nickname Little Kahnawake. At the time, Kahnawake was Kahnawake, which is another story in itself. But Kahnawake, Little Kahnawake it became. And so many people grew up, young people, grew up there, going to school there, but having grandparents even there sometimes, and hearing the language and having the customs, and eating the food, but bringing as much of the community, the culture, staying back there and trying to be. And many times, summertime would come. Kids are out of school. Well, what they would do often is they would bring them and go with the grandparents, or maybe whoever would take a vacation. They'd come back in the summertime because that's when they would be able to take them out. And I remember growing up, and I remember going to school here in Kahnawake. This is like in the early 60s. And I remember these people coming in, these kids I didn't know, who were like, we're playing somewhere, or playing on a team or something like that. And this guy had this funny accent. This
from New York.
From New York, and they would come, and then after a while, you figured out who they were. Who's this? This guy shows up, and then after a while, they're Brooklyn, they're this, and then you wouldn't see them again, and then next summer they'd show up again. Yeah, and then but most of them would spend time here, come back for the summer, and then go back in there. So there was a whole culture that was built up there also, but it was basically a Kahnawake culture in the city. Exactly. And that's what, so that really was a big part, but it also meant they began to move to other cities, and they were traveling, and the men, traveling to Texas. There were periods of time when the work was in Texas. The work was in Kentucky. Some men even worked in Labrador and Greenland, I've heard of, Saudi Arabia, and throughout the years. They've taken them all over the world.
And say it all started with sacrifice.
Yes, yeah.
Making our way here to the monument, I could see the names of the different people, the different men that passed away on that bridge. This is a monument to that sacrifice that eventually brought Kahnawake on the forefront of ironworking, but also this human sacrifice of going out on the limb of things to push technology, push the construction.
Yeah.
So it's quite incredible to be here and
to see this,
to be a witness of this effort.
Yeah. For sure, and a beautiful monument, I think, and reflecting on exactly that, exactly the sacrifice and that message, is people said, don't forget them.
Exactly.
And so these people put this monument as part of it, the recognition of how it has an impact, and it continues to have an impact on the culture of the community, on the history of the community, on a lot of different factors. Some of the things that we might talk about later, there's that whole connection. There's also part of that connection with the United States.
Yeah.
With part of it, that's part of it. There's other part about, well, our people, New York State, our people were in that's our traditional territory up to here. And there's that whole sense that this is our territory, and just because there was a line put in there doesn't mean that's we're Canadian Indians or American Indians. So that's a factor too, in all of that, or that's an issue that our people, I think, know, don't always necessarily. Not everyone expresses it, but that's an important aspect to consider in how we've looked at world. And then the idea that comes with that is about in the late 20s, when what happened was there was a man named Paul K. Dibo, and Paul K. Dibo and others were working in Philadelphia, and so they're working in Philadelphia as iron workers, and and this kind of touches with what's going on today. Paul K. Dibo and others were arrested by the U.S. Immigration Department, and they were charged as illegal aliens.
Can you imagine that on their own territory?
Yeah. And so they wanted to expel them as illegal aliens. You're not supposed to be working in here. Well, in that there was the late 20s, just before the Depression, I believe. And they ended up going to court, getting a lawyer, and using things like something called the Jay Treaty, which was, and Jay Treaty and others, and using that, and also argument about this is our sovereign territory, the border, all of that. And they took it to court. And one part of that whole thing was there was the communities that, not just Kahnawake, banded together, tried to come together to help fundraising for the lawyers, to support in whatever way they could. And they ended up winning the case. Paul K. Dibo was the test for the others. But his name was put in there as Paul. He died not that long ago. He was an older man. I'm saying I'd like to say within the last 20 years or so, he passed on. And but his name was attached to that. But they ended up winning that case using all of that. And what it did do was, in the U.S. eyes, the United States eyes, is that our people from, say, this community who want to, if my son or whatever wants to go and work in the United States, according to American law and their court cases and all that, that they don't have to apply for like a green card.
Exactly.
Like how it works now is if a person from Canada wants to, they have to make an application, and there's a whole process, and they have to look at whether, whatever.
Yeah.
And our just go there if you want to get hired, fine. You work because you are people of, for the way I look at it, we're people of this land, and this is our so that would just to many of our people, that was already something that we had, but that was an affirmation of this whole idea of this is our land and the right to work on the territories on both sides of this border. So that was another part of it. So that's an aspect that traveling, and then the whole process, there's a whole thing about what that did to communities. I mean, families bringing your children there, coming back after the highways were made bigger, the expressway, the Northways, if they call it. Then there was a 6-hour drive. And then I, as a young man, grew up, young kid, I was a kid, remembering my father working in New York for a number of years, and we waiting for him. Work was over, and they get on they zoom off, 6-hour drive, get home 10:30 at night, waiting for, and then maybe he brought us something.
Yeah,
we're allowed on a Friday night, and then he come home, and sometimes he did, sometimes he didn't, and we were just wanting to see him, and then we go to bed, and then he was around for the Saturday and the Sunday, and for us, sometimes they'd leave at like 4 o'clock or so to get back to sleep, and others would leave later and just go right to the job site. Exactly. So that became the lifestyle of many, and today, almost even though it has gone down, it's changed. There's not as many people because there wasn't as much work in that field. It was the boom was lower, I guess. Today, what happened was is that it's still there. You go around and you ask anybody and you say, "Do you know an iron worker, or was there somebody?" Sure. Everyone has somebody, whether it be their father, grandfather, uncle, their husband. And cousins and et cetera, and even some women have done that and continue to do that work. So it's just something that there's one gentleman from the community that got fame for a while. He was asked by a French radio TV show that was popular in Paris, France, one of the more popular kind of like I don't know, kind of you'd call it. He was asked if he could climb the Eiffel Tower. And he did. He climbed it with nothing, no gear, like nothing. But I mean, he didn't have any safety gear.
Wow.
He climbed. He was followed by the film crew. His name was Albert Stock, and he climbed it. And they asked him. He said, "Okay." And they filmed him all the way. But all he had was his jeans, his work boots, and he had a leather fringe jacket. And he climbed it up about, I don't know how many hours it took him, but he went up to the top of the Eiffel Tower. It's all on video, and things like that. Yeah. Albert. You go on YouTube and you see Albert Stock climbs Eiffel Tower.
Wow.
Yeah.
On that note, I think we're running a little short on time now. So I'm just going to wrap it up for this show, but we're definitely coming back for another episode because there's so much to talk about in Kahnawake. So, en général, c'est ça se termine pour cette émission ici aujourd'hui. Par contre, restez avec nous parce qu'il y a une suite à cette émission ici qui se poursuit pour un autre épisode d'1 heure parce qu'il y a tellement de choses à raconter sur Kahnawake. Et puis, Harley en a tellement à nous raconter que c'est tellement intéressant qu'on va continuer avec lui pour un autre épisode. Alors, restez avec nous sur ce documentaire qui s'intitule toujours les Kanien'keháka, hôtes sur leur territoire et voisins au quotidien.